Oh, finally, a reading where Jesus shows a little bit of emotion, huh? For some of us, it's a nice change of pace. So this reading is the well-known event of Jesus driving out the animal sellers and the money changers from the temple area. And with that, I would like us to take a few moments to properly set the scene so that we can appreciate why Jesus got as angry as he did. And for that, we basically have three things we ought to remember. The first thing is that the temple was big. It was really big, actually. And it was technically not completed yet during Jesus' life, but it was almost done. And it was very large and very impressive. And it had different areas for different purposes. Basically, anyone could be in the, I don't want to call it a courtyard, but the exterior perimeter, the outermost part of the temple was basically for anyone. But if you went from the outside to the inside, you would eventually hit a point where you would not be able to proceed unless you were ritually clean and offering up your sacrifice to the temple. And if you kept on going, you would get to the very center, the very heart of the temple. And it was a little room called the Holy of Holies. And only the high priest can go in the Holy of Holies, which means at any given time, there is one person on earth that is allowed to go in that room. Obviously, it's more complicated in real life, but that gives you an idea. The temple was big, and there were different areas for different purposes. The second thing to keep in mind is that Jesus certainly has been here before. We know that Jesus was presented in the temple when he was about 13 years old, and he would have realistically made many pilgrimages to Jerusalem for holy events like Passover. So, we don't know exactly how often Jesus did this. He might have made this pilgrimage as often as once a year. So this reading could have been his 33rd visit to the temple. And while we don't necessarily know the number, we do know that Jesus has been here before. He knows what the temple looks like, he knows how it works, and he knew what to expect. And finally, the third thing to remember is that the money changers and the animal sellers were definitely a tolerated part of Jewish culture. Now, these people probably weren't all that respected because ultimately they were profiting off of temple activity, but everybody recognized the necessity of these people. So let's start with the animal sellers. The Jews sacrificed animals to God in the temple. And when you sacrifice to God, you got to sacrifice the very best. Which means if your animal is sick or bruised or bleeding, you can't sacrifice it. And if you didn't live in Jerusalem, well, guess what? You had to walk to the temple. So if you walk all those miles with your best little lamb and the lamb stumbles and hurts its leg, you can't sacrifice that animal and your entire trip is wasted. So what the animal sellers were doing was they were allowing people to travel without the animal, just buy one at the last minute, and then sacrifice that. So it was them being able to fulfill their temple sacrifice with considerably less risk. It's kind of like going to a birthday party in another state. Do you buy a birthday cake and then take it on the plane with you? Or do you travel and then buy a birthday cake once you've arrived? Also, if you actually do travel on airplanes with birthday cakes, let me know that. I would love to hear about that. Anyway, so the last thing I have to say about the animal sellers is if you look up a classic picture of the temple, you can see animal stalls built into the building, into the temple. which means that the designers of the temple, like even before it was built, the designers of the temple knew they had to take into account people selling animals at the temple. You might say they were a part of the system from the very beginning. The money changers were just as useful. What the money changers were doing is they were allowing people to trade their Roman money for money without a person's face on it. Because Roman money had the emperor's face on it. And technically, that's in violation of the first commandment. Now, thou shalt have no other gods before me. It was a controversial issue back then about whether you could use Roman money for religious purposes. So the money changers, in their own way, were helping people honor the first commandment. So these money changers and animal sellers, these were not bad people. And their presence was not automatically offensive to the temple. So that said, why did Jesus get so angry? What did he see to make him flip out like that? Because as you probably know, Jesus does not act like this in any other story of the Bible. Well, there are three basic theories out there. The first one is at face value, Jesus was just angered at the very sight of these people. And I don't buy that. Partially because we know that Jesus was here before. Why didn't he flip out during his other visits to the temple? Like something had to change for this last one. And secondly, we know that his family sacrificed turtle doves bought at the temple, which means if selling animals is automatically a sin, then it's a sin that Joseph and Mary are guilty of. I'm not sure I'm ready to agree with that. The second theory is that the temple had gotten sloppy, and that the animal sellers and the money changers had wandered into a part of the temple where they didn't belong. Because it said in the scriptures, Jesus drove them out from the temple area. So that might mean that they were in the inner courtyard where you're not supposed to be doing business. And they might have started doing that for the sake of convenience for themselves and for the pilgrims. It's possible that happened between this reading and the time Jesus was there last. And I'll bet if that's what happened, Jesus had very good reason for being upset. And indeed, he wouldn't have been the only one. To give you an idea of that, that would be like the difference between us as a parish putting up a coffee bar in the back in the gathering space and putting up a coffee bar right here in front of the tabernacle. That would upset me, believe me on that. That is our tabernacle. That is the Holy of Holies. This place right here is not for chatting and coffee. This is a part for prayer and meditation. A few feet away in the gathering space, totally different story. A coffee bar over there would actually be a very welcome thing. Churches actually do that. That is our Holy of Holies. And that is something special. Maybe it was an issue of location, and maybe Jesus was upset that the temple was not being respected. And finally, the third one, maybe it was a problem of attitude. Maybe Jesus wasn't upset at the act itself of selling an animal or changing money, but rather these people caring about profit and money more than the worship and the act of thanksgiving of the temple. Jesus could have looked into those people's hearts and seen their true colors. Business people who were using the temple as their own tool to get what they wanted. If that's what Jesus saw, I'd say his reaction was remarkably reasonable, and some of us would probably have acted in the exact same way if we were in his place. Because you know what? When you forget about the details of what he did, what Jesus was really doing was he was putting his foot down and defending the sanctity of the temple, if only because nobody else would do it. And sorry, that was loud. And that radical and passionate defense of the temple would be remembered by Jesus' enemies. And it would eventually contribute to his crucifixion. That's what happens sometimes when you do what's right. So, there you have it. I've given you the context of the reading and the three dominant theories out there for why Jesus acted the way he did. And I leave it to you to decide where your opinion lies. You know, all three of these possibilities, one I didn't think of, I don't know. But wherever your opinion lies, I hope that you can mold your actions and attitude after Christ. And I hope that you can avoid whatever sins those money changers and animal sellers made. Because that's how we learn from stories and scripture. We learn from conflict and from heroes and from Jesus Christ himself.